This podcast is recorded on stolen and unceded Aboriginal land.
We acknowledge the First Nations and elders of this country, and we join their calls for justice.
A work from work anthem
What?
for the white collars.
What are you talking about?
Not the white collar of Shane Warne's cricket uniform.
Oh, God.
May he rest in peace. But the white collars of the lazy millennials wanting to work from fucking home, calling themselves feminists. Look, okay, no one is going to understand truly how cooked this is unless we just play a little bit. But we're kind, we love you, we like our listeners, so we're not going to play you the full fucking 6.5 minutes of this piece in The Australian. It's a ballad. I always said ballad. It's a ballad.
It's a Tom ballad.
It's a Tom ballad with the written lyrics and then a video of this business reporter from The Australian reading out why people should go back to work.
Hey, DJ, drop that beat.
Hey, you stuck at home, take a good look in the mirror. It's time to wake up and deliver. You're going to throw away your shot. You're going to throw away your shot if you're going to sit at home and rot. You really want to rise up? You want a good career, white collar? Then you better wise up if you think you're worth top dollar. Walk out that door, get back in the office, go. Your boss is not calling you in? Why not? You know these bosses, they're all disempowered, frightened by the flack if they demand you come back, that you work from work, that you put in the hours. They know the corporate culture's dying, but they're not really trying to get you back into the office, help you rise, help the CBDs revitalise. And why? It's because emotional well-being is weaponised. CEO gets a doctor's note, hey daddy-o, it's too much stress to work in the office.
We've just watched I think the worst thing that the Murdoch media empire has ever produced, and that is extraordinary to say, but I think it is up there as the worst thing ever.
Emotional well-being is weaponized.
What?
Emotional well-being, that notorious weapon. I love this. Is this just because so they want people to be in the city because businesses aren't doing as well in the city because people are realizing that they don't have to go into the office?
I mean, the whole thing is all over the place, and we'll get into it, right? But this is a work from work anthem. It is in the style of a rap from the Lin-Manuel Miranda musical Hamilton. It also says with apologies to Hamilton at the start, so they know it's shit. Okay, they know it's terrible.
Yeah,
it's Ticky Fullerton, I guess, trying to do some kind of rap with no beat whatsoever.
Spoken word.
The entire idea, I suppose, is trying to send a message to white-collar workers that they shouldn't be working from home post the pandemic because it's bad for their career. It's not right. It makes you lazy as a worker. And
But it's also like addressed to the businesses and the corporate world as being giant cucks that are too afraid to ask their workers to come, like, to go to work in a pandemic or something.
Right.
Yeah. And then also there's another take somewhere in there that, like, working from home is a conspiracy by utility companies to, like, create two offices where they have to provide, more energy and internet, which is a really interesting one. I liked that one. And then later on she gets into how if you were really a feminist, you wouldn't support work from home because the men will be more likely to go back to work sooner and get the top deals from the boss, and they will get to see the clients, and that's bad for women. So if you want feminism and equality.
But then she's also trying to, like, take a swipe at woke capital, I suppose. So, the men are in the room, the women come off worse. Big business, you want a thriving CBD, equality, work. You know how big business loves equality. Equality, workplace safety. Why are your leaders down on one knee? So now it's like Colin Kaepernick sucks and also don't work from home?
Oh, is that what you were thinking? No, I thought it was just that, like, that they were such cucks that CEOs are like – so weak now that they're on their knees begging for a scrap of labor from their workers.
But then she goes on, she says, if that's too blunt for 2022, then working from home is the new true blue. So now
working from home. Oh my goodness.
I do love to work from home. I find that working in the office just doesn't allow me to fully, become transgender or whatever the fuck. So I like to work on my own time. But that's just me, yeah.
Can we play the one more bit that's like newsflash?
Newsflash, working from home is not a human right.
Working from home is not a human right. At certain points, because she really just kind of like oscillates between being like, it's bad for the economy, actually I care, it's about feminism, it's about rights, it's about the cost of power, it's about, employees being cucks, and then it's like, fuck you, you woke fucking human rights cunts, I'm fucking sick of this, go back to work.
Unions are the devil, according to this particular rap. And, of course, we talked about it previously, but, of course, the shorter work week results in a higher productivity. But for Ticky Fullerton, of course, that won't be true. And everybody's lazy and everyone should be working hard because that's the point of living, of being alive. And if you want something better, if you want better conditions, if you want to be working less, if you want to be working less, then you're a piece of shit and we all hate you.
I say WTF to WFH.
Talk about the Greens, that bunch of idiots.
The Greens party is a party of hate.
They want to destroy the social fabric of society.
These people, these Greens, they are snake oil salesmen.
She has described the Greens as very, very dangerous.
Frankly, I've always found the Greens to be a real serious danger to Australia.
A serious danger to Australia.
And with that, welcome. We're sorry.
Oh, God.
This is Serious Danger, a podcast about green politics in Australia. I'm Emerald Moon. This is Tom Ballard.
Yo.
This is not an official Greens Party podcast. Never was. It probably never will be unless we convince them to let us be, but we're not.
We were mentioned in the Greens newsletter last weekend.
That's true.
So we're slowly encroaching into the official party structures.
So this week on the show, we will be discussing the devastating floods across Queensland and New South Wales and the politics of those natural disasters in a climate crisis. And of course, it's the Sydney Mardi Gras weekend. So we're chatting to Charlie Murphy from Pride and Protest to talk about restoring Mardi Gras to its radical roots.
Yes, indeedy. Hey, if you want to support the show, you can do so on Patreon. That would be very nice if you've got a mere $3 a month or something like that to help us cover our costs of hosting the show, paying our producer. That means a lot. Big shout out to the new patrons. We got Jim, who's our patron for $6.66 every month.
Classic.
Side of the beast. Jai, Stephen, Sam, Ross, Fox, Daniel, and Claire. Thank you so much for supporting the show and welcome to the Serious Danger Patreon family. You can follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube at Serious Danger AU, or for all the info, just go to seriousdangerpod.com, baby.
So let's say, for the sake of argument, that all of the water levels around the world rise by let's say 5 feet over the next 100 years, say 10 feet by the next 100 years, and it puts all the low-lying areas on the coast underwater, right? Which, let's say all of that happens. You think that people aren't going to just sell their homes and move?
Just one small problem. Sell their houses to who, Ben? Fucking Aquaman!
So in case you hadn't noticed, there's been some weather.
What?
Some pretty fucking intense weather.
Let's not talk about the weather. Talk about the weather so boring. It's what people talk about when they can't talk about anything else.
It hasn't been boring. I'll give it that. It's not been boring this week. East Coast has been absolutely smashed by intense rainfall and flooding. It was, southeast Queensland kind of last weekend and Brisbane late in the weekend. Started heading down to northern New South Wales early in the week and then hitting Sydney later on. And now there's storms in Victoria and they're saying there's just more to come. So it's not even over yet, apparently, which is fucking insane.
Yeah.
I think trying to grasp the just absolute gravity of the situation and how fucking insane this weather system has been is very difficult. But I'll read out a few figures to try and help you understand how insane this is. So in Brisbane.
It's time for Emerald with the weather.
This is Emerald with the weather, yeah. So in Brisbane, between 9 a.m. Friday and 6 p.m. Sunday last weekend, 612 millimetres of rain fell. In Lismore, Wilson River peaked at 14.4 metres on Monday, which is 2 metres above the record. So the problem that happened in Lismore was that they breached the 10.6 metre high flood levee. 350,000 people affected by evacuation orders or warnings on the North Coast, more than 1,000 people rescued. In Brisbane, 15,000 homes flooded in the city, 1,544 people at least in evacuation centres in the southeast, 51,000 people without power. In Gympie, 3,600 plus homes were flooded. And as at the date that we are recording this, so this is Saturday, 15 people had died as a result of this extreme weather. So 10 people died in Queensland and 5 in New South Wales, and the searches are still ongoing. So that death toll could actually rise.
Yeah.
So it's fucked. It really is.
It's all fucked, and all of that would be tragic enough this year, but also the stories I've been seeing through the news, the sense you get is a lot of these people have been smashed by such extreme weather events in the past or by regular flooding. So I saw one story of a family who, got flooded last year, had to get a new kitchen. Their kitchen was finished. That new kitchen was finished on Monday, I think.
No.
Like literally the week of these new, and then it all gets flooded again. I mean, it's again heartbreaking if it happens once at all, but clearly for a lot of these folks and families, this has been happening a lot and more frequently in recent years.
Yeah, and even, people talking about places where they've been hit by the bushfires and then they got hit really bad by the pandemic and now they've been hit badly by this flooding. And even though in Lismore, like, for example, so I went to school in Lismore, which is why it's very much on my mind, but it's definitely, it knows floods, but nothing like this. That's why people were getting trapped in their roof, having to bust through their roof to get out because they just didn't expect it to rise, the water to rise like that. They've got people sheltering on roofs overnight. In Brisbane, we had cranes floating down the river. We were worried that was going to collide with something. There's this really, distressing footage of a houseboat just suddenly sinking as it collides with a ferry terminal.
Ugh.
It's, the numbers are one thing, but I think everyone probably has just been hit with this barrage of images and, footage all week that is, it's crazy.
And it is like more severe than the 2011 floodings in Brisbane,
yes.
right? It's officially crossed. Like it's
in some places, yeah. So in Brisbane, in some places it's not as bad. In some places it's worse. In Lismore, definitely the flood that they always speak about as the worst was 1974, and it's much worse than that. You can now see the flood markers that I always saw walking around going to school up on the telegraph poles. They'd have 1974 marked, and I was like, no fucking way. And now I'm seeing the markers like meters above that. So yeah, it's insane. But we wanted to talk about, the response to this from government. I think as there should be, there has been a little bit, there's been a fair bit of criticism. There was criticism initially, especially in Brisbane, about, you're doing the right things with the dam releases. Were there enough warnings? Why weren't people warned earlier? Why weren't there enough boats to rescue people? There are housing shortages. There aren't enough evacuation centres and they're not, widely distributed enough. Do you think, because this is such an insane weather event, like, is it fair to ask that they were better prepared?
Well, I mean, look, I don't know. The logistics involved in any of these kind of rescue operations always sort of blow my mind, I suppose. And whenever these moments come around and you see the head of emergency services on TV, or you hear these stories, or you hear the stories of community coming together to help each other, it's very hard to wrap your head around. I've never experienced anything like this. Never even. I think I was we were on a holiday once somewhere. I can't even remember where, and there was a bit of flooding, and we needed to put sandbags out. That's my entire interaction with disaster relief. So I don't know, but surely after 2011, after the previous floods that have occurred, one would hope that emergency funding would be better. And certainly ahead of the Black Summer bushfires, a lot of the narrative was the fact that governments were warned that these conditions were coming and would give rise to horrific bushfires, and that, yes, that funding for certain emergency services had either stalled or actively gone backwards. And that's bad.
And that is bad. That's exactly right. As the floods crisis was unfolding, it was reported in, I believe, Crikey, the fact that there was this $4 billion emergency response fund that the federal government established in 2019, and people asking why the fuck has that not been spent, because not a single cent has been spent on disaster recovery. No readiness projects commenced construction from that $4 billion fund. Everyone's like, why not? We obviously need that. That was actually, it was established even pre-bushfires.
Yeah.
So the federal government's response is that, there is a rule written into the establishment of that fund that says that it has to be a fund of a last resort. So we can't spend the money until all other funding avenues have been exhausted effectively. And that's like, I even after I saw that, I didn't really see anyone go, well, exhaust the other funding allocations then. Like, because clearly they need more money. So spend the money and then spend the $4 billion. Like, the fact that you haven't exhausted the other avenues, that's a problem in itself. But, of course, not everyone in the government is bad. We did have a hero among the ranks of the Liberal Party in Peter Dutton, who, generously set up his own crowdfunder, I believe, to fund a flood recovery response. Tom, have you donated?
I have not got around to that just as yet. Yeah.
Very, selfish of you.
But obviously I will. I regularly give money to Peter Dutton anyway, so it makes sense to just extend that in this particular case. How much money has he raised? What sort of coin are we talking here?
Actually, I have not even looked at it. I think the last I saw here, it was like minuscule. Like he'd raised maybe, a couple of $100s in days because everyone was just going, what the fuck is this? You are the government. Like, if only there was some way of getting money from corporations and people who have a lot of it, and then some sort of central body to get that money and distribute it to where it's needed. I don't know. Someone should come up with some sort of system. We could call it like taxes or, a government.
Taxes?
It's just an idea. It's a crazy thing I've been thinking about.
What is he on? Sorry, I'm just trying to look it up now to try and see what he's going there. I mean,
Is it still on?
$27,000 raised of his
Are you kidding me?
$25,000 goal.
How many donors does it say?
Nope. Oh, Robert White donated $15,000. So
okay, I was going to say, I bet that they would have seen that. They would have been copping all this flack, and then some fucking liberal stooge, they've gone, oh, can you bump it up so that we don't look like a fucking failure as well as looking like idiots?
It's like your parents inviting kids to your birthday party to prove that you have friends.
Yeah, that's pathetic.
Oh, 179 donations. There you go. But yes, $15,000 of that comes from one gentleman by the name of Robert White.
There you go. Okay.
Wonderful.
So, yeah, the response from the federal government, absolutely fucking dismal. There are some payments that have been made available both from federal and state governments. It's $1,000 per adult from the federals under the disaster recovery payment if your home was affected by the floods. And there's a means-tested payment if you've lost income on, the poverty rates that they offer for job seeker. So I saw someone say, have your home destroyed by a flood and you too can live on poverty rates. Obviously completely inadequate. And they exclude international students and migrant workers can't claim.
Fucking hell.
Same as COVID payments. So
bloody foreigners coming over here, getting caught up in our floods,
flooded.
in our Aussie, Aussie floods.
It's truly, we laugh, but it is absolutely fucked up.
Yes.
At the same time, there is this thing when the government, and we saw it during COVID too, at least in some parts, when the government just completely fucking fails, but the community actually steps up and fills the gaps. And rather than taxes, we see, fundraisers, and we see Facebook groups sharing information that the government sources aren't getting out to people. We see, people getting together to clean up houses, to provide funds, resources, donations, that sort of thing, which is really, it's beautiful, but it's kind of devastating in the same way that they have to fill in the gaps and are so, we live in a society.
What?
But we do, where those mutual aid and like community networks are not resourced, and yet the government's not stepping in either. So it's like, it's not enough. People can only do so much.
Yeah. And there is I was seeing this argument playing on Twitter too. There is a very strong conservative argument about, say, civil society, or basically that volunteering is more noble and better, and the government shouldn't have to write all this stuff because we can take care of ourselves as a community. We can look after one another, which sounds like a lovely idea. And I think even in, in any socialist utopia, the idea of people looking after each other is obviously fundamental to the whole fucking society.
Yes.
But it does seem to be provided as a very convenient excuse to have lower taxes, and then rich people can donate to whatever the hell they want as they wish and pick their favorite causes. And they can volunteer that particular work or that donation, that it doesn't need to be taken off them, or wealth and resources don't need to be redistributed through the state, of course, because that's very bad.
Yeah, I didn't want to, I don't think I sent it to you, but there's an op-ed in the Courier Mail today about effectively, advancing this argument that the recent disasters, and they're talking about COVID as well, but they show that government needs to fucking butt out because they can't do it anyway.
What?
And this is largely, I think as well, it's this hoo-ha about the fact that the Premier in Queensland close schools or announce that people should take their kids out of school because there were further storms coming. The storms didn't eventuate and everyone was pissed off. But yeah, there's this like almost liberal argument that's like, see, this is an argument for small government. Look how much better, we can do it ourselves. But there is also an argument like those same people would be the ones that argue that socialism or communism is impossible because everyone's just out for themselves. Neoliberalism posits that individuals are only motivated by self-interest, whereas what we see when these disasters happen is the exact opposite of that. People actually get something out of helping each other, and they will help each other if they can and as much as they can.
Yes.
But, the thing is that we are forced to rely on occasionally government, but, increasingly private responses. And I was even thinking this week about how insane it is really that like private insurance is an industry that is allowed to operate. Like I think an inherently exploitative and kind of evil thing that should not be provided by private markets that are primarily driven by profit. I don't know the full story, but I think after the 2011 floods, like there's still protracted court cases around whether insurance would cover the fact that a lot of that flooding was caused by dam releases. And like insurance companies arguing that they wouldn't cover that water. And now, Suncorp is coming back and having a whinge. They had this little bit of media basically, complaining about how this is going to cost them so much. And a similar argument to the one that we then saw from the disaster recovery chief, blaming people for having houses in flood-prone areas. You saw this, Tom, didn't you? This chief being like, well, if you want to live among the gum trees.
Yeah, you got to smash a few bushfires. You got to, if you want an omelette or whatever. I don't know if that works. But he was basically saying that these houses shouldn't be rebuilt, right? That these houses have been knocked over a number of times. They've been destroyed, which yes, I'm interested to hear your thoughts. Well, but like while they are still cleaning the fuck up, like how normally we're the ones saying, hey, we should talk about climate change when there's these natural disasters, and we absolutely should. But Jesus Christ, man.
Yeah.
Read the room.
I do have a take. Yeah, I will say something. I'll come back to this later because we're going to talk about the IPCC report. But the way that he said it was just like fucking insulting. Like it is just, when people's lives have been fucking shattered.
Yes.
And you're saying, well, if you want to live there, I don't know, what do you expect?
Just buy a house somewhere else. You know how easy that is in Australia at the moment.
You know what we expect, though? We expect our government to fucking listen to the science and, like, stop fucking burning fossil fuels.
Yes.
Because that is the problem. That's the problem. I think it's like, yes, a long-term view and realizing it is not going to be on our current trajectory sustainable to have those homes there. Probably they will keep getting flooded or they will keep getting burnt. But the problem, the villain there, are not the people living in the homes. It's the fucking governments and fossil fuel corporations that are making climate change worse because, newsflash, like this weather would not be happening to the severe level that it is and as frequently as these events are happening if it were not for those corporations and, their fucking major party mates who want to keep burning fossil fuels. It's just a fact.
Preach.
It's just a fucking fact.
Preach.
The Greens, I think we put out a policy when the bushfire stuff was happening about levying fossil fuel companies to fund a bushfire response. I don't know if that could also, if it's just a disaster response, I imagine that that's talking about funding like emergency services. But yeah, it's like make the people who fucking cause the problem pay. Don't go having a go at people who've just lost their home for having their home there. It's honestly pretty disgusting. And Dominic Perrottet, I actually don't know how do you say his name?
Perrottet, yep.
Perrottet?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, Dominic Perrottet. he got a little bit cancelled for, I thought it was kind of weird. People fixated on the fact that he was saying it's a 1 in 1,000 year flood. And I think the reason that people were like a bit sensitive about this is because it's this implication that like the reason this happened is because no one was prepared. Scott Morrison, probably a lot of people didn't see this, but a lot of people in the Northern Rivers and in Lismore were pissed off about the fact that Scott Morrison got in front of the news. He told Nine people in parts of southeast Queensland and northern New South Wales are accustomed to flood events, but not Lismore. And if you live in Lismore or Lismore, that makes you go, what the actual fuck? Like Lismore floods, it is a walk. It is absolutely used to flooding. My school would always flood. Like, flooding is a very regular thing in Lismore, but not to this extent, which is why I don't think that, like, calling it a 1 in 1,000 year flood, that is what it is in terms of like in terms of like terms that are used in flood planning to indicate the usual or the expected frequency of an event of that kind, of that magnitude. And the problem is not like the fact that actually this isn't a 1 in 1,000 year flood anymore, and so we shouldn't use that language. It's the fact that like our flood planning obviously hasn't incorporated or adequately accounted for climate change, which means that a 1 in 1,000 year flood, quote unquote, is going to be occurring much more frequently than once in 1,000 years.
Right. So that sort of refers to the size of the flood or the impact or the kind of the scale of this flooding event, right? That is sort of the sort of extent. Yeah. I mean, I can understand why. It does give the indication that it's a freak occurrence. Who can wrap your head around, oh, Mother Nature, she's so crazy. She's always throwing this stuff at us.
She is.
Whereas obviously the political implications of this is that we need to prepare for this. We need to stop doing anything that is going to make events like this more frequent, i.e., furthering the climate crisis, obviously. But yeah, I mean, we need to accept, or we don't even need to accept the fact, it's a fact of life that natural disasters are going to occur regardless of the scale of climate change. And those natural disasters are often going to be devastating, right? Mm-hmm. Being alive on planet Earth, you're going to experience the forces of nature. And I think probably most people are on board with that. But anything that would make these terrible events even worse should obviously be brought to a halt. And yes, we should absolutely invest in preparations to combat these events, to survive them appropriately, to try and minimize the damage as much as possible, surely.
Yeah, there's got to be somewhere in between, like acknowledging that natural disasters happen, and maybe it's not, that's going to happen regardless of climate change, and just completely abrogating any responsibility, like the Queensland Premier just repeatedly getting mad at journalists asking about her government's response and being like, I can't stop Mother Nature. It's Mother Nature. Sis does what she wants.
She's a girl boss too, just like me.
We didn't know that was going to happen. This is Mother Nature. I can't control Mother Nature. The people of this state can't control Mother Nature. And sometimes they throw stuff at us and we've got to deal with it.
So meanwhile, all of this is unfolding before our eyes, an absolutely incredible disaster. On Monday, as this is really kind of peaking, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, aka the IPCC,
party poopers, decided
that these messy bitches thought now was the time to drop the second installment of their 6th assessment report. So they do these reports where they basically, it's like a vibe check for climate change. They're like, what's the go? Like, what's happening? What's going to happen? And yeah, so they examine the current and projected impacts of climate change, global warming. And in this report as well, they looked at options for and barriers to adaptation and mitigation. It's fun reading. Have you read any of this thing, Tom?
No, I haven't read it because I knew you were prepping this, and I'm like, oh, everyone will tell me all the worst bits. I'll be fine.
Yeah. No, you don't. I don't suggest reading it, especially flicking between reading this report. I read the summary for policymakers. I'm not reading the whole thing because I'm not a scientist. Mm-hmm. Flicking between that and like pictures of or like videos of my fucking schoolmates' families' houses just like full of mud. It's not that fun. But yeah, so the report says that climate change is already increasing the frequency and severity of natural disasters, including bushfires, drought, flooding, and extreme rain.
Check.
Coincidence?
Mm-hmm.
I spoke to this, thankfully I had therapy on Tuesday night. And so I got to speak about this, as I do. And my therapist, though, was like, do you think that this flooding and these disasters maybe will cause people or governments to wake up and finally do something? Do you think – what do you think, Tom? Are we saved?
Wake up. This country needs a fucking shake up. I remember that song.
Yeah.
Look, sure. Tell your therapist yes.
No.
Tell your therapist to keep deluding.
I told my therapist no.
I mean, what was it described? An atlas of human suffering, I believe, was this new report, which the head of the UN.
Oh, for fuck's sake! Yeah, I think it was.
Yeah. So there's that, but I mean, one immediately thinks of the last IPCC reports where I forget the headlines as well. But yeah, they clearly, and you'll see this a lot out of climate scientists, are clearly trying to, as much as possible, use some pretty dramatic language to really try and increase the urgency, to try and make this appeal very clear that the science is settled, or it's very clear that this is a serious problem, that urgent action is required, and that waiting for net zero to 2050 ain't going to do it, Chief.
Yeah. Yeah. Let me run you through a few of the fun things that are going to happen to us.
Could you rap it to me like from a production of Hamilton?
I will not. I will not be rapping this.
Okay.
But the report says things are already very bad, and we've already kind of hit the point where we may not be able to save. We probably won't save, for example, the reef. It's cooked. We need to act now to avoid, existential climate collapse. And if we go beyond 1.5 degrees of warming, which on current policies, very likely, our efforts to then pull it back to a safe level to adapt and to mitigate the impacts will be even harder, because there'll be kind of like cascading and compounding impacts. We can still act, we can still mitigate the worst of it, but on current projections, forests, reefs, and wetlands.
Forest queefs and all.
Forest queefs, all cooked. I was taking notes on this for work, and my notes were literally like, forests are cooked, reefs are cooked.
Ugh.
Mass biodiversity loss and extinction, major food and water security impacts. There was actually a fair bit of time spent on this and impacts on food and agriculture and, very scary stuff. Interestingly, in current times, more disease, more heat and weather-related illness and death. And also they talk about mental ill health, which obviously we know about.
So good for your therapist then, I guess.
That's exactly right. Mm-hmm. It's good for big therapy. Climate change. But there is this question. I saw a little bit of criticism. We see this mostly coming from the right, but even from people who accept that climate change is real, it's caused by humans, and, it will have very grave impacts and we need to act now. There are a few people who criticize the IPCC report for being too alarmist. There's this guy that I was kind of going down a rabbit hole reading, and I think he, I don't quite trust him, but I think it's an interesting criticism. Roger Pielke, not sure how to pronounce his name, but he has frequently criticized, for some time, criticized the use of the less likely or the more severe RCPs in the IPCC report. Now, I'm doing too many acronyms, but the RCPs are the representative concentration pathways. So they're based on greenhouse gas concentration, and they have a bunch of different scenarios effectively. And so they use that to go, okay, if we have this concentration, this is what the world will look like, et cetera. Mm-hmm. So RCP 8.5, for example, that's the upper limit in the report, which would be 5 degrees of warming over pre-industrial levels by 2100. The predictions based on current trajectory or current policies are more like RCP 3.4 or 4.5, which is about 2 to 3 degrees of warming. Obviously, that is not RCP 1.9, which was the original Paris Agreement goal to keep warming below 1.5 degrees, but above pre-industrial levels. Yeah, so Roger Pielke says that the report talks too much about RCP 8.5, which is very unlikely to happen, and those really high concentration levels. In an attempt, he said, this is politicizing science. It's about scaring people. And it then kind of discredits the science, or maybe people switch off because they're like, well, that's just too unfathomable. And he's like, why not concentrate or focus on the more realistic pathways? I'm curious, what's your take on that? What do you reckon?
Well, when I watched an ABC report on the IPCC report, and there was a bit where it sort of said that, the reef is fucked. This isn't a direct quote, but the reef is messed up no matter what we do.
Yeah.
And I do remember feeling in that moment like, Jesus Christ, it can be incredibly demotivating. It can, rob you of an investment in any kind of serious climate action, or even if we do lots of things, that's still the result. Jesus Christ, what's the fucking point? So not that my feelings affect the global emissions much at all, but I can understand that. I get my hackles up whenever anyone says something like the science has become politicized. I mean, everything is politicized, particularly on this question when you're talking about the transformation of the economy or the way we live our lives on this planet. Of course, the implications of the science will have political implications and a huge political debate. That's unavoidable, I would say.
Yeah, it's like, are you asking the scientists to simply avoid using any language or references that might be emotive or that might require a policy response? Like, how do you talk about food shortages? How do you talk about like enormous, financial and human impacts of natural disasters? It needs to be spoken about. But I think it is interesting, this delicate balancing act that I think the IPCC and a lot of, climate scientists and campaigners as well are trying to walk this tightrope of like, you have to understand how grave this is and the fact that like we are on a really dangerous path and in fact something's already fucked, balancing that with some sort of hope because you need that to spur action. So like the report does, like the message, the overarching message of the report is things are very, very, very bad. But if we act now, we can still substantially reduce the impacts. We can't eliminate them all, but we can substantially reduce them. And the two kind of broad-based things that we need to do that are drastically reduce emissions. It's interesting that I always find when I read the IPCC reports or the summaries of them, they don't specifically, like in this one at least, they don't specifically talk too much about fossil fuels. They don't talk about, phasing out coal and gas in this report. But to be clear, like that is what is required. The UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, confirmed he made a tweet that that means phasing out coal by 2030 for OECD countries. He said, quote, "You cannot claim to be green while your plans and projects undermine the net zero target and ignore the major emissions cuts that must occur this decade. This decade. Get the chili bin. Fish and chips. People see through this smoke screen.
We need to save the queefs this decade. Yes.
Yeah, I'm doing really well. But yes, that seemed. I mean, I read that and I was like, hello. Liberal and Labor parties.
Yeah, that's weird.
People see through this fucking smokescreen.
Well, again, the ABC reporter that did the story that I watched sort of did this tweet thread sort of pointing out the very muted political response to this report. It was remarkable. And of course, Labor Party isn't too crazy about going out there and talk about it because the idea of phasing out something like the coal industry by 2030 is absolutely anathema, something they reject. Labor, both federally and at the state level, will say that Australia's going to dig up, export and burn coal for decades and decades to come.
Mm-hmm. It's because their climate policy is purely a placeholder and something to keep them safe from criticism in their minds. It has absolutely nothing to do with the science.
Right.
It's just completely divorced from it and from what we actually need. So that's the first thing, drastically reduce emissions, in the next decade. And the second thing that the report focuses on is transformational change rather than short-term solutions. So this is where, circling back to those comments from insurance companies and from evil Gumtree disaster recovery chief guy about maybe those homes shouldn't be rebuilt. It's interesting because this report does talk about how maladaptation or adaptation that doesn't adequately account for future projections could be worse because it'll just mean having to go back and do it again and compounding the impacts. And that means things like if houses by the sea are getting flooded or getting, impacted, maybe you need to move those communities and accept that you can't live there anymore, which I don't want to be the guy that tells people that they can't live in their home. But I think that's one of the most interesting and kind of depressing parts of the report among the many depressing and interesting parts.
I mean, you see that much more. I think, again, another report the other night I watched about on the coast of the UK, erosion. I mean, there are much more tangible examples in this country too of just erosion, literally this ground will not exist that your house is on. So I think everyone would probably accept the fact that, no, you can't live in that house or that, you have to do something about your future of living in that house. I suppose broadening that perspective to include natural disasters is a reasonable thing to do. But if that relocation is to happen, that's something that we should collectively do. That should be a social political project and a recognition that it's not people's fault who live in those houses.
Yes.
Of the disaster that we're talking about here.
Yeah, exactly. Provide them a fucking home. But yeah, and they talk about the fact that a lot of the responses from governments so far have been very short-term focused, and also that they're not transformational. And so there's a pretty clear tone running throughout the report that talks about the fact that these problems have been caused by colonialism and capitalism, and those things will not save us. And this is why, those are also why countries and communities in the global south, for example, and poorer people and marginalized people are being and will be far more heavily impacted by global warming, but also that they must be involved in the response. And it talks a lot about including First Nations people and local communities in planning and implementation for adapting to and mitigating the impacts of climate change. So it's quite radical in that sense. It's not just, climate science that says we're all fucked and, so we need to start driving Teslas. It really is if you don't actually look at the structure of this fucking economy and global society and start there and adapt that whole thing, change that whole thing, then it's not good enough. It's not going to work.
Hey, the Greens are good on this. We have good policies.
Anyway, pivot.
Vote for them. You know what this show's about. Talking about phasing out coal and gas by 2030 with support for workers, a transitioning coal communities and fossil fuel communities so that no one's left behind. A 75% emissions cut by 2030. Net zero by 2035. That's in line with the science, by the way. In the Climate Council, the Labor Party has a target of 43% reduction by 2030, which is... as well as great stuff like treaty with First Nations people to incorporate that kind of knowledge and that planning and implementation, taxing the billionaires to do it. Folks who listen to this probably know this. But my question to you, Emerald, is do you think that the climate question has been somewhat neutralised as we go into this election period? Because certainly from the Labor point of view, that's how they feel about it, putting out their shitty climate plan, which is not going to do anything to address the climate crisis, but they feel has neutralised the attacks from the right wing about their policy position. The Morrison government's campaigning on net zero by 2050. And there has been some commentary lately that the Greens aren't cutting through, even though, the climate crisis is in many ways front of mind for a lot of people and is obviously coming up, with horrible events like this week. Do you think that it's not on the table as much as it once was?
No, I think it absolutely is. I think I can only really speak to Queensland and particularly to Brisbane where we have people door knocking. But I think even in the regions actually when we have spoken to people who are listening to volunteers that are having thousands of conversations with people on the ground, keeping in mind that that's a bigger sample size than a lot of the polls that you might see.
Yeah.
And climate change is coming up more than it ever has before, unprompted. And I think particularly among young people, and I think that I've seen certainly, including among flood-affected communities, an acknowledgement that this is climate change and that this is our major parties failing to act, and the fact that, there is a direct link between them taking money from fossil fuels, allowing fossil fuel projects to go ahead, fossil fuels to be burnt, and the devastation that we're seeing in our communities. I don't know, I can't verify that link or what the impact of these disasters on how people vote will be without going out and talking to people yet. But I actually think it will be more relevant. I'm not usually the climate change gal. I don't I think, in the past, usually a lot of people haven't voted on climate change as much as they care about it. I think certainly health and cost of living and education and those things will continue to be the primary drivers in terms of how people vote. But particularly among younger people, I do think climate will increasingly be a factor.
Well, if it's a factor for you, vote Green, please.
Vote Green.
Vote Green.
I never meant to call you in your sorrow.
Okay, other news on this weekend that isn't World War III or, the climate crisis or the flood or Shane Warne. It is the final weekend of the 44th Sydney Mardi Gras, the massive queer cultural event that started as a radical protest and these days is sponsored by the likes of Qantas and American Express, and sometimes has cops marching and even a Liberal Party float. To chat about Mardi Gras politics, we are joined by Charlie Murphy, my friend, a former Mardi Gras board member, an out and proud sex worker, and a member of the grassroots collective known as Pride in Protest. Hi, Charlie. Happy Mardi Gras.
Hi, Tom. Happy Mardi Gras to you as well.
Hooray. Do we still say that? Is it still okay to say Happy Mardi Gras?
Yeah, it's still politically correct. I'm bringing it back. That's my election platform. Is we're going to say Happy Mardi Gras again.
All right, why don't we start with what Pride in Protest is? If people aren't familiar with Pride in Protest, who are they? What is it? How did it come about?
Yeah, so Pride in Protest is a grassroots queer collective that kind of grew out of a float that was in the Mardi Gras parade called No Pride in Detention, and that was based on ending mandatory detention and onshore and offshore processing for refugees in the country. You might have remembered there was a headline a while ago about some rowdy protesters saying some mean things to Bill Shorten in the Mardi Gras parade, which they got in a little trouble for.
Yes.
Yeah, that was us.
By a little trouble. Now, my memory of this story is that an organizer from Mardi Gras came down and specifically said to people in this particularly radical No Pride in Detention float, shut up, stop criticising this Labor Party float in the Mardi Gras, even though Labor Party supports mandatory detention of refugees, including people who escape persecution because they're queer. Stop making trouble at this political protest, what is supposed to be a political protest. You're embarrassing us. This is a bad look for us as an organisation. Is that sort of a fair summary?
Basically, yeah. And that's kind of been the dynamic between us and, criticising Labor and Liberal and corporates in Mardi Gras ever since. We had that, and then we thought we would expand a little out from the parade and actually run for the board of Mardi Gras, and running explicitly on a platform of progressive politics, around decorporatising Mardi Gras, around, declaring things like support for refugees, support for sex workers, and also for removing police out of the parade. But from there, we have become campaigners for queer rights, throughout the year and on a legislative level as well. So yeah, it's it's a collective that, we started at Mardi Gras, but we do a whole kind of host of things now as a radical group around queer rights.
We want to talk about the broader range of demands that Pride and Protest have, absolutely. But just staying on Mardi Gras just for 1 second. I mean, for people who don't know, and maybe people have been to other Pride events around the country or around the world, they might get a sense of this. But what are we actually talking about when we're talking about Mardi Gras, a event that had its roots in a very radical protest organised by communists, by anarchists? The first Mardi Gras in 1978, they were bashed by the cops, arrested. It was an extremely radical, broadly anti-capitalist protest that was sort of talking about a bigger picture about queer liberation. I mean, how have we got from that in the late 70s to where we are today, when you will see, I remember years ago seeing a massive Colgate float with Delta Goodrem sitting on top of a giant tube of toothpaste down Oxford Street, which, again, it was all fun. It's all still very fun, but it really does seem to have changed in nature fundamentally as an event, an organisation. How's that happened, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it has heaps to do with the pink dollar and the sheer amount of tourism and money that the event can bring in as a cultural event. But I think there is a tension between that and, the obvious politics of queer people and the things that we still need to see changed for our community. And I think that you're seeing this across a whole host of different cultural events. There's this tension between who is present, who's sponsored, who is put forward in terms of sponsors and corporates, and then what, people who are actually involved in the festival want. With Sydney Festival, there was, the tension between the funding from Israel Tourism with the, crimes against the Palestinians by the Israeli state there. For queer people, it's really pronounced by the fact that we have all these sponsors that in our eyes are committing a number of human rights abuses. One of the things that we focus on with Qantas is the fact that they do participate in mandatory detention. Now, we can be really narrow about it and say, well, they're sponsoring Mardi Gras and they're deporting refugees back to danger. Some of those refugees are queer. They should have a good Mardi Gras too. There's that, but there's also the fact that, no refugees should be ever be deported back to danger. We as queers just don't want to stand for our own community.
Yeah.
And so I think when we stand for that as a queer community, we have to stand for everyone who is experiencing oppression. And so often there will be sponsors that will be committing those forms. You know, we did an action at Fair Day, which is this kind of picnic in the park that happens at the start of Mardi Gras. And we were flying around Amex's financial discrimination of sex workers. Amex was one of the credit card companies that pulled out of Backpage, which was a website in America that sex workers used. It had a tool on it that allowed sex workers to communicate to each other about who bad clients are, essentially. So it made their work safer. They pulled out of Backpage because they were tailing US police forces. What they were doing was, you know, it was a program of quote unquote anti-trafficking. But really, most of the time, when that happens in countries where sex work is criminalised, on the whole, it actually makes sex workers' lives more dangerous. And so them, you know, tailing US police forces in pulling their services out of Backpage got it shut down. Got those tools that sex workers use to keep each other safe shut down. And it also meant that sex workers in Australia and even in New South Wales here, where sex work is decriminalised, couldn't actually use the site to advertise their services. So, you know, while on one hand, you've got the people who celebrate Mardi Gras, the people in our community, which a huge number of them are sex workers. On the one hand, you've got corporations who sponsor Mardi Gras on the other, which really at the end of the day has nothing to do with the rights that, you know, I as a sex worker experience or anyone as a queer person experiences. It's about saying that they want to advertise their brands while they can pinkwash or put these things that they do and basically sweep them under the rug and say, here you go, have a drink, have a dance, shut up, don't talk about these issues. We don't want to hear about them. And most of the time that's what ends up happening on an institutional level as well, because what Mardi Gras will end up doing is every time that these things come up, they'll put a press release out, not only just being like, well, you know, yes, we have this partner or whatever. It's literally like a statement that says like, yeah, they're our partner and actually they've done the right thing. With the Amex stuff, they were like, yeah, no, Amex are a great partner and they won, you know, 100% from the HRC, you know, equality index or whatever piece of, you know, like neo-lib kind of NGO rating systems that amazingly all these American companies get 100% for. They all get 100%.
It's incredible, isn't it?
It's an amazing coincidence.
Isn't that like, you know, if you're a gay person or queer person, you work at Amex, you'll have a wonderful time and we have all these policies, but they exclude the fact that that company might be doing horrific things to queer people through their business.
Yeah. If you're specifically on the board of American Express and you're a queer person, you're going to be doing great in life, basically. That's what
a lovely time.
Yeah.
Wasn't there one year, am I remembering this right, when it was at Truvada itself, there was some pharmaceutical company that was a partner, and in the US, that same company was seriously price gouging the price of PrEP, which is a medication which can severely reduce the risk of HIV infection and transmission, right? Didn't that what happened one year?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it was Gilead Sciences.
Gilead, that's right.
Yeah, we were successful at the AGM at getting them condemned as a sponsor, and eventually they were no longer part of the festival. But in the US, they were price gouging PrEP. If you were an uninsured American, it costs you $1,700 a month.
Fucking hell.
To get the medication.
I think like the funniest argument that I hear people make, and particularly they say it about cops, is that by trying to exclude particular groups from the festival, you're being like hypocritical because, you know, Mardi Gras is about inclusion and Pride is about inclusion, and it's actually discriminatory to exclude cops, which is just wild, right? Like, what do you think about the arguments that it's hypocritical or it's discriminatory or exclusionary to exclude cops?
Yeah, it's amazing that every time that someone uses that argument, it's amazing who that is reserved for. You know, like it's amazing that every time people talk about inclusion and making sure people feel welcome, it's always the police, corporates and liberals.
Yes.
Whenever they say that, those are the three people that they are talking about. They are the three people that saying that actually these are the people that we should make exception for. And most of the time it's not even an exception. It's like, not only should they be there, but actually like you should like it, you know, like you should actually appreciate it, you know, that you shouldn't be so negative about it and complaining, because every time someone goes, well, we need to include the police, it's always framed in the way that it's like, well, actually, they're better now and they're fine now and that's good and that's all that we can really hope for. And at the end of the day, like, it's a very depressing way of looking at the world. It like what they say when they're like, well, we should include the police is actually like being like, well, look, there's nothing that we can really do to radically change any of these things. It's like, yeah, the police will, you know, still murder Aboriginal people, or yeah, I mean, they'll bash a trans woman from time to time. But at the end of the day, you know, they do their, you know, sensitivity trainings and all this stuff. And, you know, isn't it nice that they're in the parade and that some of the officers are gay or whatever? Well, that's what that argument boils down to.
Yeah, be grateful.
Yeah, to be grateful, really. And the other side of that argument as well is like, I think it's I think it's just a disgusting and insulting way of using the concept of inclusion. You know, like when we say inclusion, like we really should mean like, how are people materially included in society, or how are they politically included in society? And, you know, people who aren't materially and politically included in society, the reason why they're not is usually because it's at the hands of corporates, liberals, or the police. But what, you know, that's the way that we should talk about inclusion, not whether, you know, the New South Wales Police Force can be included in the list of floats. And, you know, people say, well, what about, you know, this officer or that officer? You know, like, they can march in their fucking water polo team for all I care. They just can't do it with the uniform of the institution that is continuing to commit crimes against Aboriginal people of our own community on a day-to-day basis.
It seems to me to be, again, another instance of, you mentioned the neolib bullshit before, like the replacement of collective or systemic politics, which I would argue was pretty embedded in the original Mardi Gras parade and the kind of politics that was kicking around there, with the politics of the individual. So as an individual person, you can join the police force. If you're an individual queer person, you can be in the police force and it won't be as bad for you. You can be out and proud. You can be married with your same-sex partner and you can have a nice time as a police officer, as an individual within the force, unlike you could in the late 70s or 80s, for example. And that is presented as a sign of success and progress, which ignores, of course, as you say, as an institution, what the police does to not only the queer community, poor people, First Nations people, the systemic impact of that institution has on society. It seems that, we don't want to talk about that anymore. We just focus on individual stories of girl bosses and yes queens within these horrific institutions.
Yeah, and I think like also what it is just like, it really is the denial of the concept of like politics moving or changing anything, because like the sum total of the politics of what Mardi Gras is now is really that baseline of just being like, if you have gay people in this institution or you have gay people in that institution, then that's the good thing. Like, it doesn't actually analyze, you know, the material problems of society. You know, for the Mardi Gras parade to say, well, you know, yeah, it's good that a gay person is in the Liberal Party or in the police force, like that's the end of the conversation. It's just like, well, being gay is good, and then being gay wherever you are is good. So therefore, that place is good, or it's getting better because those people are there. And that's such a shallow way of thinking about the politics of the world, you know, like it's not dynamic. It's like, yeah, gay people are great. I mean, some of them are also not good, you know, we're a real mixed bag, you know.
So let's talk about what Pride and Protest are going to do about this stuff. As you say, it's not just about Mardi Gras, the event itself, but about broader queer politics and making queer people's lives better. You recently wrote in the Sydney Star Observer, much ink has been spilled about whether Mardi Gras should be a party or a protest, ink which washes away when we actually ask the basic question, what do we currently need? How can we truly experience the abject state that the Liberals want us to live in and not take to the streets? Now, we're recording this on Saturday morning. People will be hearing this when it comes out on Sunday. So the parade will have happened and your protest will have happened. Tell us about the rally that Pride and Protest is helping to organise today. That is Saturday afternoon. What's it about? What are the big demands?
Yeah, so the rally today is the second daytime rally that we've done for Mardi Gras, which happens during the day before the parade. And last year was quite big, and this year we hope for it to be even bigger. The key demand is to stop the bigots bill, so that's around the religious freedoms bill. Now, I know that, that there's been a kind of concerted interest for some people to say, well, the bill is dead. Because it got sunk after a single amendment passed. But it's our belief that, just because the Liberals are often licking their wounds about this bill, there's nothing to stop them bringing it back. And I don't think we can rely on, this idea of, well, if the Liberals don't win the next election, it's going to disappear. I don't think we can really trust Labor on these questions either. I think that they were quite easily wedged, and Anthony Albanese has already promised his own version of the bill. We really want to say, when it comes to these legislative attacks against the queer community, that we're not going to accept them in any form, and that we don't want to see any forms of amendments or slight changes to the bill that was proposed by the Liberals earlier this year. We want to kill that bill dead. And at the moment, it's not just that bill as well. ScoMo, because he's so incredibly transphobic, seamlessly pivoted from supporting the religious freedoms bill. And then after it was sunk, was out campaigning around Senator Claire Chandler's bill. Now, that bill is a transphobic bill that deals with excluding trans people from participation in sports. So it's clear that Scott Morrison is trying to use bigotry and hatred of gay and trans people as a wedge for the election. And we want to clearly say that we don't accept that as a community, and that we're going to have a strong, loud and proud march down the street about it. Some of the other demands are decriminalisation of sex work in the states that require it, no pride in detention, so an end to mandatory detention offshore and onshore, to fund services and not policing, so a defund the police demand. And finally, for transition leave. Transition leave, is a form of leave taken at work that we believe is the right of every trans worker to be able to take. It's incredibly materially hard for a trans person to exist in society. Really to have stable employment of any kind. Actually, they deserve to have some form of leave that allows them to take their transition, whether that be social, medical or legal, at work. And that requires them to have paid leave like maternity leave. It's our hope that we could see a demand that was put forward by members of the NTEU at the University of Sydney, which was 6 weeks of paid leave every year for trans people to take if they need and if they wish for their transition. So we want to see transition leave as a serious type of leave that is granted to all workers across all industries. So we're really hoping for, to proclaim at Mardi Gras that actually we want a world that's not just going to say, we have these institutions, I guess that, they have their problems, but things are okay. No, we actually want to say we want a radically different world where the rights of queer people and the rights of other oppressed communities are loudly and proudly affirmed and actually materially won. And we're also going to be having a march for Trans Day of Visibility on the 2nd of April, and that's just not happening in Sydney, that's happening in a number of other state capitals around Australia. So keep an eye on socials for where that might be in your state.
Amazing, Charlie. That's so fucking good. Yeah, we all, queer allies, like people who are interested in radical politics, need to take a very strong stand against the sentiment that I think is pretty strong out there, that the fight is over, that marriage equality was the last thing that the queer community needed, and we've got that now, and now everything's sorted. Yeah. And I think Pride in Protest particularly is a living testament to the fact that that is absolutely not true. Campaigning hard to wake people up from that and shake them out of that. So more fucking power to you. I suppose, we're a podcast about the Greens and we like Greens politics. Anything that the Greens can do or should be doing better? Or how do you see the Greens fitting into a queer radical vision for a better future for everybody?
Yeah, in New South Wales, it's really important to support Abigail Boyd's amendment to the Anti-Discrimination Act to include sex workers on the ADA. The reason for that is because we have decriminalisation of sex work here in New South Wales, but actually, the discrimination of sex workers goes just beyond, whether the police have their boot on our neck or not. It's about, whether sex workers, if they're discriminated against, when they go for other employment or any other service that they might access in society. It's important that we actually have anti-discrimination protections for sex workers there.
So that's things like getting a loan or applying for a rental, things like that.
Those kinds of things, the financial discrimination is rife enough for sex workers in terms of the way that we're treated by big banks, discrimination against by tech and all those things, it will contribute in a small way to protecting the rights of sex workers, in the ways that the Anti-Discrimination Act might cover people for other reasons, whether it be their sexuality or their religion or so forth.
Amazing. All right. Well, thanks for taking time out of your Mardi Gras weekend to talk to us on Serious Danger, Charlie. We'll put in the links to the Pride and Protest socials so that people can follow and see what's going on. And yes, that fight doesn't stop once Mardi Gras is over. It carries on. Thanks very much for your time, Charlie. Solidarity. Happy Mardi Gras. Have a good time.
Thanks so much, Charlie.
Happy Mardi Gras. Thank you to you both. See ya.
Not over yet, lesbians. I keep thinking about, I went to this, I may not be going to Mardi Gras, but I went to the Moaning Lisa show last night, very queer band, and like just a bunch of queers screaming along. They have a song where they basically just scream names of famous lesbians. And, she finished and had a couple of songs yet, and she just goes, "It's not over yet, lesbians," which I love.
Keep that in mind, everyone. It's not. I watched Wild, that Stephen Fry movie about Oscar Wilde the other day.
Oh yeah, and
Oscar Wilde rules. Queers are the best. Why would you be not queer? You're weird.
It's exactly 100%. 100% queerdom by 2030.
Well, thank you, Charlie Murphy. Now, we talked extensively about the devastation this week. How can people help other than donating to Peter Dutton's fundraiser?
First Peter Dutton, of course. But if you're looking for somewhere else, definitely, like if you're in one of those communities and you can spare time going and helping people to clean up their homes, like there's the Mud Army, coordinated by Council and Volunteering Queensland in Brisbane. There are kind of hubs in the Northern Rivers where you can go and you'll get assigned a job and you can go help people. But at this point, it does seem like a lot of people will need money. So if you can give money, you can give money via Give It, which kind of matches donations to the sources that need them. We'll put the link in the show notes there, but it's giveit.org.au/storms-and-flooding. Particularly if you are looking to support people who have been affected by the floods in the Northern Rivers, there's a donation directory that's basically just kind of crowdsourced. It's got a bunch of information in there, and it's got a list of kind of GoFundMes, and it's also got links to organisations that are doing flood relief. We'll put the link to the full spreadsheet in the show notes again. The two from that I know are very, credible and accountable fundraisers are the Koori Mail fundraiser, and that's primarily support for First Nations communities and families that have been impacted, and the Lismore City Council's Lismore Flood Fund, which again, it's kind of fucking insane that the council has to ask for donations, but there you are. So they're all linked in that spreadsheet. Please give what you can.
Yeah. And obviously, if you've been personally affected by these floods and stuff, we're thinking of you and sending you a lot of love and solidarity.
We really are.
Serious Danger is produced by Michael Griffin and made possible with the help of the Green Institute. Rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts. Give it a review. 5 stars would be really lovely if you feel that reflects how you think this podcast is. Share it around. We really appreciate that. That'd be great. You can always email us hello@seriousdangerpod.com. Thank you, dear Emerald. I'll see you next week.
See you next time.
Bye. Oh, yeah, let's go out with some sweet beats from Ticky Fullerton.
Oh, yeah.
Hit it!
Lockdown did weird things to human beings. People staying in their gym jams, eating lots of Tim Tams, people making lots of philos, stacking on the kilos, people getting fatter, binging on Emily in Paris in Succession, people getting thinner, too many home gym sessions, dropping in size on account of all that free time for extra exercise. Oh, so you bought a canine to keep you sane. A labradoodle, a caboodle, a spoodle, a groodle to help you doodle. And so you remain working from home to give the dog a bone because you can't leave the dog alone. No worries, work can get you on the phone. Tragically, you are not alone. But it's not good what you just did. Hey, a dog's for life, not for COVID.
This is a serious danger to Australia.